In the still dawn of September 9, 1739, along the banks of the Stono River in South Carolina, silence broke with the pounding of drums. A small group of enslaved Africans, armed with stolen weapons and an unshakable hunger for freedom, began marching south toward Spanish Florida. Their goal was not wealth, not revenge, but liberty. Their rebellion, later known as the Stono Rebellion, would shake the very foundations of slavery in colonial America. The uprising began with fewer than 24 rebels, but their ranks swelled as they marched, burning plantations, striking down their oppressors, and calling others to join their cause. Their cry was not whispered, it was loud, defiant, and undeniable: freedom at any cost. For enslaved Africans across the colonies, the Stono Rebellion became proof that chains could be broken, that resistance was possible, and that even in the harshest conditions, hope could ignite like fire. For white colonists, however, the rebellion was terrifying. The fear of revolt had always haunted slave societies, but Stono made that fear real. In its aftermath, laws grew harsher, punishments more severe, and surveillance more suffocating. The rebellion was crushed, but its echo lingered, a reminder that slavery was never secure and that freedom was always worth the fight. This is the story of the Stono Rebellion, the rebellion that began with drums, marched with fire, and left a scar on America's history that still speaks today. South Carolina in the early 18th century was not a peaceful frontier of growth, but a colony balanced on fear. Beneath the rice fields and indigo plantations that fueled Britain's Atlantic wealth, a simmering tension threatened to explode. That tension was the presence of a majority enslaved population living under harsh labor systems ruled by a minority of colonists who constantly feared uprising. The rebellion that would erupt at Stono in 1739 did not come from nowhere. It was born of centuries of exploitation, culture, faith, and the human will to resist. By the 1730s, South Carolina had become one of Britain's most profitable colonies. Its swampy lowlands produced rice and indigo, two crops that brought immense wealth to planters. But these profits came at a staggering cost. From sunrise to sunset, enslaved Africans bent their bodies in waterlogged fields, battling disease, insects, and exhaustion. Mortality rates were brutally high. For many planters, enslaved people were not seen as human lives, but as investments calculated by the pound of rice or dye their work could produce. Enslaved Africans in South Carolina far outnumbered white colonists. By 1739, nearly 2/3 of the colony's population were enslaved. This imbalance created both opportunity and danger. It gave planters immense labor power, but it also meant that any rebellion could quickly overwhelm colonial authorities. South Carolina was, in many ways, a society always on the brink of revolt. Most of the enslaved Africans who toiled in Carolina came from the Kingdom of Congo and the wider regions of West Central Africa. This origin mattered deeply. Many had once been soldiers, farmers, or artisans before their capture. Some had been baptized Catholic when the Kingdom of Congo first encountered Portuguese missionaries. Unlike the stereotype of isolated captives, many were familiar with European languages, religion, and military organization. They carried with them not only grief but also a living memory of struggle. The white colonists, aware of these numbers and origins, lived with constant anxiety. Laws were drafted to prevent uprisings, restricting the movement of enslaved people, punishing gatherings, and forbidding the possession of weapons. Patrols roamed the countryside at night, searching for signs of unrest. And yet, fear was not enough to stop small acts of resistance. Enslaved workers slowed their pace in the fields, broke tools, pretended illness, or fled into the swamps and forests. Carolina had already seen earlier revolts and plots, though none as large as what was to come. Every whisper, every rumor, every unexpected sound of drums at night set planters on edge. By the late 1730s, outside pressures made the colony even more unstable. To the south lay Spanish Florida, which openly encouraged enslaved Africans to escape. Spanish officials in St. Augustine promised freedom to anyone who reached their territory and embraced Catholicism. It was both a gesture of sanctuary and a weapon of imperial rivalry, undermining Britain's economy by offering enslaved people a path to liberation. For Africans trapped in Carolina, the idea of Spanish Florida was more than a dream. It was a real horizon, close enough to imagine, dangerous enough to risk. The year 1739 brought the breaking point. Britain was on the brink of war with Spain. Tensions along the border were sharper than ever, and the planters of Carolina grew more paranoid about losing their most valuable property. Among the enslaved was a man remembered in the records as Jemmy, sometimes called Cato. Believed to have been literate and of Congo origin, Jemmy became the leader of a group ready to act. They were not the first to dream of freedom, but they were among the first willing to risk everything to seize it. Their rebellion would explode into the largest uprising of enslaved Africans in Britain's mainland colonies, and it would burn its way into history. The Stono Rebellion was about to begin. The summer of 1739 in South Carolina was marked by tension that most colonists could sense but chose to ignore. The plantation economy had grown vast, powered by the labor of thousands of Africans brought across the ocean against their will. They outnumbered Europeans in many districts, and their presence was a source of both profit and fear. Planters relied on strict codes to keep order, laws that dictated movement, gatherings, even the smallest signs of independence. Yet beneath the surface of daily work in the fields and workshops, a different kind of order was taking shape. Whispers carried between workers, quiet meetings in the woods, and messages passed in native languages the masters could not understand. The enslaved remembered their homelands, their traditions, and the rhythms of freedom, and those memories refused to die. South Carolina had become especially vulnerable that year. News drifted northward from Spanish Florida, where officials promised freedom to any enslaved African who could escape southward and pledge allegiance to the Spanish crown. The idea of liberty, of a life without chains, spread quickly among the enslaved communities of Carolina. Rumors whispered that the Spanish offered not just refuge, but land, weapons, and the chance to live as free men and women. For those who had endured years of whips, hunger, and separation from family, the prospect was irresistible. It was against this backdrop that a group of men began to plan. They were strong, determined, and carried with them the experience of African wars and traditions of resistance. They understood the risks, but they also knew that silence meant slow death under the sun of the cane and rice fields. The time for patience had passed. The time for action was near. The rebellion spread like fire carried on the wind. Word traveled from plantation to plantation, and enslaved men and women, hearing the distant sound of drums and the sight of smoke rising against the Carolina sky, understood that something extraordinary was unfolding. Some ran to join the rebels, seizing whatever tools or weapons they could find. Others, fearful of punishment or torn between survival and resistance, stayed behind, whispering prayers as their hearts raced. The group that began small grew steadily larger as they moved south, a moving tide of defiance pushing toward freedom. At the head of this force, the leader known as Jemmy carried himself with unshaken resolve. Accounts say he spoke to the group in a mix of languages. Some understood him, others simply followed the rhythm of his voice, a call to courage that rose above the fear that clung to them all. Each step carried them closer, not only to the promise of liberty, but also deeper into danger, for the colony's authorities were already stirring. Riders galloped toward Charleston, carrying news of the uprising, while militia groups gathered their arms, determined to crush the movement before it could grow beyond control. For the rebels, every decision carried enormous weight. Each plantation they approached was a chance to gain numbers and strike at the very foundation of the system that had bound them. Yet each act also left behind a trail of fire and alarm, a signal to those in power that their grip was slipping. The rebellion had moved beyond a single act of desperation. It had become a force, a challenge that the colony could neither ignore nor easily contain. By midday, the rebellion had shaken the countryside. Smoke rose in dark columns, marking the path of the rebels as they pressed forward. They sang as they marched, the beat of their voices and the rhythm of their steps carrying defiance through the humid Carolina air. For a brief moment, the plantations, once symbols of order and control, trembled under the weight of those who had been forced to labor on them. Every strike against a master, every torch set to a building, was more than destruction. It was a declaration that they were no longer silent, no longer invisible. But the colony responded with speed and violence. By afternoon, armed militia had assembled, men on horseback with muskets and swords, riding hard toward the uprising. They were fueled not only by fear of losing control, but also by the knowledge that if the rebellion spread further, the very foundation of Carolina's wealth and power could collapse. The land itself seemed to hold its breath as the two forces drew closer, one fighting for the preservation of power, the other for the promise of freedom. As the sun began to tilt westward, the rebels and militia clashed. Gunfire broke the air, and the sound of drums and voices was drowned by the crack of muskets. Some of the rebels fell, while others pressed forward with unyielding determination, wielding axes, hoes, and captured weapons with desperate strength. The battle was uneven, but it was fierce. For the rebels, it was not only survival at stake, it was dignity, memory, and the hope that even if they did not live to see freedom, their defiance would echo for generations. The fighting raged into the late afternoon, and the humid Carolina fields became a battleground of smoke, blood, and cries that carried far into the trees. Outnumbered and outgunned, the rebels fought with the ferocity of people who had nothing left to lose. Some swung their makeshift weapons with desperate precision, others shouted prayers and war cries as though summoning strength from ancestors across the ocean. For a fleeting moment, the militia wavered under the force of their determination, but muskets and horses gave the colonists the advantage. Slowly, the rebellion began to fracture. Rebels fell one by one, cut down in the chaos. Some scattered into the forests and swamps, hoping to vanish into the wilderness or find refuge among marooned communities that had long resisted colonial control. Others refused to flee, choosing to stand and fight until the end, their bodies becoming testaments to courage. The militia pressed harder, knowing that any survivor could inspire another uprising if left free. By nightfall, the rebellion's strength was broken, but its fire was not extinguished. Dozens had been killed, others captured, and some executed with brutal swiftness. Yet whispers would spread of those who escaped, carrying the memory of that day with them. For the enslaved who remained, the rebellion was more than a tragedy. It was proof that defiance was possible, that chains could be challenged, and that even against overwhelming odds, courage could shake the ground beneath empire's feet. In the weeks that followed, South Carolina was gripped by fear. The rebellion had been crushed, but the memory of armed Africans marching down the road with drums and banners haunted the minds of the colonists. The government moved quickly to ensure such defiance would never rise again. The Assembly passed the Negro Act of 1740, one of the harshest laws of its time. It stripped away what little autonomy enslaved Africans had managed to keep. Education was forbidden. Teaching a black person to read or write became a crime. Gathering in groups without white supervision was outlawed. The beating of drums, the blowing of horns, the very tools of communication and resistance were banned. Freedom of movement was restricted more tightly, curfews enforced with severity, and punishments grew even harsher for those who dared to disobey. These measures were meant to break spirits, but they revealed something the colonists would never admit aloud, that they feared the people they held in bondage. Every chain, every law, every whip was a response to the possibility of rebellion. The Stono Rebellion had shown that the enslaved were not passive victims of empire, but human beings willing to risk everything for liberty. For the enslaved, the new restrictions deepened suffering, but also kept alive the memory of defiance. Songs and stories carried the names of those who fought and fell at Stono. Mothers whispered the tale to children, fathers spoke of it in hushed tones in the fields. Even silence carried meaning, for the act of remembering itself became resistance. The rebellion had been crushed in body, but its spirit endured, an ember glowing in the shadows, waiting for the next breath of freedom to ignite it again. The Stono Rebellion did not succeed in toppling slavery in Carolina, but its impact reached far beyond the fields where it began. For the enslaved, it became a story of courage, proof that even in the darkest of conditions, people could rise and strike for freedom. For the colonists, it was a scar that never healed, a reminder that their system rested on violence and fear, always one heartbeat away from collapse. The rebellion reshaped laws, hardened divisions, and deepened the cruelty of slavery in the South. Yet, it also left a legacy of resistance that inspired generations to come. From whispered songs in the quarters to the uprisings of later years, the spirit of Stono lived on as a symbol of defiance. When historians look back, they see the Stono Rebellion as more than an isolated event. It was part of a long continuum of struggle, one thread in the larger fabric of Black resistance across the Americas. The men and women who marched on that September morning in 1739 may not have lived to see freedom, but their actions carried forward, shaping the story of liberty itself. The road to emancipation was still centuries away, but the flames lit at Stono never fully went out. They smoldered in memory, in culture, and in the quiet determination of those who refused to accept bondage as destiny. The Stono Rebellion was not just a fight. It was a declaration that even in the face of overwhelming power, the human spirit will not be silenced.